Today's topic is water chemistry. We'll be specifically looking at how the structure of the water molecule gives it special properties that have allowed life to flourish on our planet. As a preview, those properties include polarity, cohesion, adhesion, capillary action, temperature control, including high specific heat and evaporative cooling, the unusual density differential between solid and liquid water that allows ice to float, and water's role as a very versatile solvent. Starting with something that you just learned about yesterday, which is the polarity of the water molecule. As a reminder, polarity is the unequal sharing of electrons. We're creating polar covalent bonds within the water molecule. Remember that oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, which means it is pulling harder on those shared electrons. You can see that visually in the diagram at the right. The electrons are physically closer to oxygen. Now, the reality is the electrons are moving. It's just they're spending more time with the oxygen nucleus than they are with the hydrogen nuclei. But you can just think of it as them just kind of like huddled close to the oxygen atom. And that, of course, creates a differential partial charge on these two sides of the molecule. Remember that little lowercase delta means dipole or partial charge. And so we have a partially negative charge on the oxygen and a partial positive charge on the hydrogens. All of the properties that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this lecture are subsequent to this structural feature, the polarity of the water molecule created by an unequal sharing of electrons between oxygen and hydrogen. You should be able to draw a diagram similar to the one that you see there. You should be able to label the charges, and you should be able to explain how this unequal sharing of electrons is creating a polar molecule. So what other properties are subsequent to that polarity? Let's start with one of the two main ones, cohesion. Cohesion, technically, it's just the linking of similar molecules, usually through hydrogen bonds. For us, really, cohesion is water's attraction to itself. And like I mentioned, along with adhesion, which is the next one, this is one of the two core properties that actually create the other ones that we will analyze. And that will kind of, if that doesn't make 100% sense to you, it will as we go on and discuss them. But before we go there again, let's look at the diagram at the top here. This is just showing cohesion of water. This is water's attraction to itself, specifically the partially positively charged hydrogen of one water molecule being attracted to the partially negatively charged oxygen of another. And you can see that it's not just like one and one, like a pair. They're doing this in all directions that are available to them. And these are transient. So they're kind of being made and broken over and over and over. But the upshot is that these molecules are attracted to each other. And if given the opportunity, will cluster together. An example of how one of the core properties like cohesion can create another one is the creation of surface tension. This is really just cohesion in action. So surface tension, you've seen this if you've seen a water strider, or if you've balanced like a toothpick on the surface of the water, or if you've put a bunch of little drops of water on a penny and created that little bubble. All of those are created through cohesion. So let's look at the diagram here in blue. You can see each of these blue dots is representing a water molecule. They are creating interactions with each other in all directions that are available. But for the ones on the surface, there is no water molecule above them. Obviously, that's air. Instead, they are attracted to and creating hydrogen bonds with the molecules only next to them, like on either side and below. So that's creating this, it's not a skin, but it's almost like there's a little bit on the top that can support some weight because of that lateral attraction between them and the attraction below that is like pulling them down. So that's surface tension. But I'd love for you to consider, like, what's beneath the surface tension. Really, that's cohesion. What's beneath cohesion? That's just hydrogen bonding that's created from the polarity of the bonds within the water molecule. So you need to kind of understand all of the layers of these interactions. The other core property of water is adhesion, and this is water's attraction to other molecules. Now, I put the general definition, but we're really talking about water. So this is water's attraction to other stuff. So this could be other polar molecules or other charged particles like ions, for example. And like I said, this is, along with cohesion, one of the two core properties that creates the others. Now, I discussed in the last slide the bubbling of water on a penny. That dome shape, if you could look at the diagram in the bottom right, the dome shape is created by the cohesion, right? All the water molecules are holding on to each other and not spilling off. But the reason that bubble doesn't just roll off the penny is the adhesion between the water molecules and the surface of the penny. So it's an attraction there. So just think cohesion with each other, adhesion with another. Another application of cohesion and adhesion is water droplets on a spider web. The round nature of the droplet is created by cohesion for similar reasons as we just described. And then the reason that the little bubbles of water stay on the web at all is adhesion. Capillary action, like surface tension, is one of those secondary properties that's subsequent to the others. So let's look at that. Capillary action is just the movement of water through a narrow space, but it's created through the combined forces of cohesion and adhesion. Really, really important applications in a variety of places, but particularly for the movement of water and nutrients through plants. So let's first look at this zoomed in diagram, and then we'll talk about that application. If you look at the zoomed in diagram here, you can see that the water molecules are interacting with each other through cohesion, right? They're pulling each other up through space in that plant vessel, in that xylem tube. And also, the water molecules are interacting with the tube, like the side walls of the tube, through adhesion. And that is also going to help them climb up the walls of the tube. Now, that could be either neutrally without gravity, it's like not pulling down, we're going up, or against gravity, right? So why do we care so much about this? This is allowing water to get absorbed through the root hairs and then pushed through plant vessels, the xylem tubes, to the end where they are needed in leaves and then all the cells of the plant. We will actually talk about this more in a future unit, but for now, we just need to focus on what's creating this phenomenon, which is capillary action subsequent to cohesion and adhesion. Moving on to temperature moderation, water has what we call a high specific heat. In other words, it resists changes in temperature. So to understand that, we should define temperature. Temperature is just the average kinetic or movement energy of molecules. Let's look at this diagram at the bottom right. You can see we have 3 samples of water. The one on the left is the coldest with the lowest temperature, and the one on the right is the hottest, the highest temperature. You can see that the colder one has a lot less molecule movement, and the one on the right with the highest temperature has the most molecule movement. In other words, the colder one has less kinetic energy than the hotter one. Moving faster here gives you a higher temperature. Okay, so to understand water-specific heat, we have to remind ourselves of the interactions between those molecules. The cohesion of water means that those water molecules are forming hydrogen bonds with each other, which means they're like holding each other together. In order to get them to move faster, we have to disrupt those hydrogen bonds, kind of rip them away from each other. Well, that takes energy, more energy than it would take to get other molecules moving that weren't attracted to each other in that way. So what that means is that water can absorb a lot of heat energy without actually increasing much in temperature. And that has a bunch of important applications. Let's talk about those. So why do we care about this? For one thing, this can moderate the air temperature in areas near large bodies of water, because that water can absorb heat in the daytime and release heat at night. So that stabilizes the atmospheric temperature in those areas. One way to think about this is to just remember a time when you went to the beach. If you look at the diagram at the right, you can see a representation of what I'm sure you have experienced at the beach, which is if you're standing in the sand, it feels hot, hot, hot. If you make your way over to the water feels cool. And that is despite the fact that both the sand and the water, and here they're even showing asphalt, those are all being exposed to the same amount of sunlight energy, right? So you probably never really thought about it, but that is kind of weird, right? They're both absorbing the same amount of heat energy, but they aren't responding with the same temperature. And that is because of water's high specific heat. It's able to absorb a bunch of heat without increasing in temperature. And at night, it's just the opposite. It can release a bunch of heat without changing in temperature much either. That also means that the ocean temperature, and this goes for large lakes as well, is more stable, right? Because it can absorb and release a bunch of heat without changing much in temperature itself. And this benefits marine life because that allows creatures to not be able to withstand huge swings in temperature. It keeps their environment more stable. This also plays a role in organisms being able to resist changes in their own internal temperature. Let's talk about that a little bit. One way that water helps to moderate the temperature of individual organisms is through evaporative cooling, or the cooling of a surface during evaporation. So you've experienced this if you've been sweating on a hot day. You can see this elephant is experiencing this as they splash water on their head. This is all down to the heat of vaporization of water. The heat of vaporization is how much energy it takes to convert a substance from a liquid to a gas or into a vapor. This is very, very similar to water's high specific heat. It has a high heat of vaporization because of hydrogen bonding, right? If we're trying to get the water molecules that are currently interacting with each other as a liquid on the surface of your skin, for example, to get those to jump apart into a gas and move enough to turn into a vapor, we need to disrupt those hydrogen bonds. That takes a lot of extra heat energy, and that is going to mean that the energy that would have gone into your skin is now going into creating that phase change from water into gas. Some important applications of evaporative cooling: this moderates Earth's climate, stabilizes temperature in lakes and ponds, working with and similar in idea to the high specific heat of water. It all kind of works together. And we just talked about preventing terrestrial organisms overheating. This also works for leaves. So leaves that have water on them will prevent overheating in the plant by utilizing the evaporative cooling of that water. Next up is something that's so commonplace in our world that you probably don't think about it much, but it's actually super weird. And that is that the solid form of water is less dense than the liquid form. That's not usually the case. If you can look over on the right, if you are like, wait, what is density again? Density is just how closely clustered the molecules are, how much stuff there is per unit volume. And you can see at the top we have ice. Those water molecules are farther away from each other, therefore there are fewer in the same amount of volume. And as you go from ice to warm water and to cold water, you can see that the density changes. So the most dense is the cold water, where the water molecules are moving very slowly. The middle here is the warm water, where they are moving faster. And then the ice, the reason why the ice is the least dense of all is because they get moved away from each other and kind of stuck. They're not free to move, right? They're vibrating in place, as all molecules do, except for at absolute zero. but they aren't moving around in relation to each other the way that the molecules are in liquid water. And so because of that, and they're kind of stuck apart, it is less dense and will therefore float. And that is super, super important to life. So what this does is prevents large bodies of water from freezing solid all the way down, which is obviously important if you are a fish or whatever. And also the layer of ice on the top of like a frozen lake, for example, is, in addition to preventing full freezing down to the bottom, is going to insulate the water that's below it, and that's going to allow life to survive underneath in relatively warmer water than it would be. And finally, let's talk about water's role as a versatile solvent. Before we get into what makes water particularly versatile as a solvent, let's look at some vocabulary so we know what we're talking about. Starting with, what is a solution? A solution is just a type of mixture in which everything is evenly distributed, even at the molecular level. So if you take a sample in one spot, it's going to be exactly the same in distribution as if you took a sample in another spot. So each solution is made up of two things: a solvent, which is the thing doing the dissolving, and a solute, which is the substance that's being dissolved. This is one of those things where an example is very helpful. So look down here at the diagram. You can see we have salt as our solute. So let's say it's sodium chloride. We have water as our solvent, and we're creating a salt water solution, or a mixture of salt and water in which all of the salt is evenly distributed or dissolved. What makes water a very versatile solvent is its polarity, of course, right? The polarity of the water molecule means it has charged ends, or partially charged sides, that can interact with other charged particles. So that could be other polar molecules, or it could be ions. So in this case, sodium chloride is an ionic compound, and in water it's going to separate out into ions, charged particles, positively charged sodium ions and negatively charged chloride ions. Those are going to create hydrogen bonds, and that is going to create the effect of dissolution that we are seeing here. Let's look at a zoomed in picture to see what's going on with the molecules themselves. Here we can see two applications specifically of this versatility as a solvent, where water is interacting with two different kinds of solutes. So the example we were just talking about is here on the left, and you can see the water molecules interacting with the charged particles of sodium chloride. And those interactions are strong enough that they are actually pulling those ions out of the crystal that they started in. So you see the little clump over there, that's the crystal. And then those ions are being separated and then surrounded. And you can kind of see here that the positively charged sodium, that's the Na, is interacting with those red parts of the water molecule. That's of course the oxygen, and the oxygen is negatively charged or partially negatively charged. That's why that works. And you can see we have another, we call this hydration shell, around the chloride ion, where the positively charged hydrogens are interacting with that negatively charged chloride. So that is creating the even distribution, or the dissolution. Over here is another application that's super important for living things, and that's the dissolution of a polar protein. Now, this is looking a little bit different because clearly proteins are huge generally, and it's much, much bigger. So you see the water molecules are smaller in relation, but we're still seeing those same interactions happening to get those proteins out into the water and interacting in all directions with those water molecules to create the solution that we have seen. All right, you did great. We will talk more about water and see it in action in class tomorrow. See you soon.